So, welcome to this webinar on early lessons learned from mandatory BNG in England. My name is Adrian Bodrement, and I am a senior research manager at CIRIA. There is a lot going on in this space to celebrate this one-year anniversary, and we have a fantastic panel of speakers today to go through some of the learnings since last year and talk about examples and opportunities. All right, but before we do that, let me just give you a little bit of an overview about CIRIA. So CIRIA stands for the Construction Industry Research and Information Association, and we are a not-for-profit member-based organization. We've been around for 60 years plus, and our goal is to improve the industry's performance in the many topics and sectors that we focus on. Biodiversity is one of them, obviously. So we do this by providing the industry with guidance documents. We are very well known for those. Like some of them are the SETS manual, the ROC manual, the Levy handbook, but also the Biodiversity Net Gain principles and the guidance associated with it that came out back in 2016, I believe. So we also provide training courses. Some of them are based on our guidance document, but also awards to showcase what is being done within the industry and to promote good practice. And of course, networking events so professionals can get together and learn from each other. This is a snapshot of our membership. We are very proud to have members from pretty much the whole spectrum of the construction industry. So you can see here from tier one contractors, from designers, from consulting firms, but also, of course, academia, local authorities, universities, etc., etc. Our work within biodiversity have started quite a while ago. So back in 2013, we created the Biodiversity Interest Group, and we started the Biodiversity Challenge back then to really reward those projects that put nature forward into their urban development. Then I mentioned the Biodiversity Net Gain Good Practice and Principles that we released in collaboration with IEMA and CIEEM. And that was followed by a series of documents in green infrastructure. But more recently, and you are going to hear about it, we released the mandatory BNG in England guide, which with IEMA and CIEEM again, and we will talk a little bit more about that later on. The objectives of our community of practice focused on biodiversity is really to improve the biodiversity value within our sector and to really embrace the biodiversity net gain principles and to go beyond those. This community of practice is a place for collaboration and knowledge transfer. And we want it to be a place where practitioners and experts can share ideas, what works, what doesn't work, opportunities and barriers around biodiversity net gain. And it's really to enable peer-to-peer discussion on everything that comes up in this field. This webinar is being brought to you by our membership. So I would like to give them a big thank you for being a supporter of the Biodiversity Committee of Practice. You can see the logos here on screen. We will hear a little bit more about some of them during the webinar. All right, so with that, I would like to pass it on to Michael Murphy. He is the Master Planning Manager at Heathrow, and he has a long history working with us on biodiversity. So not only is Heathrow a supporter and a member of the biodiversity committee of practice, but Michael was the chair of the judging panel several years in a row for our biodiversity awards. Michael, your turn.
Thank you, Adrian, and welcome to everyone to this wonderful webinar to celebrate 1 year of the BNG in place. Before we begin, we've got some housekeeping, as you can see on the slide in front of you. All attendees will be on listen-only mode. Raise your hands to indicate if you have something you'd like to say. Thumbs up, always good. We want it to be interactive as possible. Questions to go into the chat, and then we'll have them put through to the panelists at the end. We do want this to be a more interactive role, as there is 182 people here now, so that's fantastic. So in today's program, you can see we've got quite a lot to cover, and we've got some fantastic speakers. When we move through, sorry, there was one thing I forgot to say. Don't forget to do the poll at the end if you want to get your CPD hours in, and don't forget to share your views on the @BIG Biodiversity, #Biodiversity Net Gain, #Sustainable Development, and #Ecology Matters. And we're aiming to finish about 12:30. So apologies for getting the social media stuff again. So what brings us together? We'll be reflecting on early lessons learned since the world leading initiative of Biodiversity Net Gain became mandatory for most planning applications in the Town and Country Act in England. We're going to explore the key drivers and principles of BNG in England and provide practical steps for success to protect nature and deliver sustainable development. You're going to hear firsthand from the lead authors of Series 3 guidance, Mandatory Biodiversity Net Gain in England, a guide produced by IEMA and CIRIA. Our speakers today are absolutely fantastic. I've had the privilege of knowing most of them on different panels and different workshops over the years. I'm going to start with Annie from Buckinghamshire County Council. She's the Biodiversity Net Gain Officer for Planning, Growth and Sustainability. Alistair Law, Founder and Chief Executive of Vertical Meadows. Tom Butterworth, Director and Lead at ARUP on Nature-Based Solutions and BNG. Dr. Julia Baker, who I constantly see these days in a number of forums, Technical Director of Natural Services at Mott MacDonald, the wonderful Dr. Nick White, Principal Advisor on Net Gain with Natural England, and Helen, apologies if I mispronounced your surname, Helen Newell, who's the Group Head of Biodiversity at Barratt Home Development. We'd also like to shout out some special recognitions just before we get going. So, as many of you know from the industry, the wonderful Dr. Martina usually leads on a lot of these things, and I've stepped in to cover because she's got some other obligations. But without her drive, her gusto, BNG and Biodiversity Champions probably wouldn't be happening as well as it is. So a big shout out to her. Dr. Julia Baker from MOTS, in recognition for her co-authoring the mandatory net gain guidance documents and practical guide. Tom Butterworth, in recognition from co-authoring the Biodiversity Net Gain Good Practice Principles for Development. And Dr. Nick White again, and Helen for contributing to the aforementioned guidance documents. Really are driving the industry forward in such positive ways that we all recognise and want to see. So, at this point and on time, I'd like to introduce you to Annie Ottaway, the Biodiversity Net Gain Officer for Planning, Growth and Sustainability for Buckinghamshire County Council. I'm very much looking forward to this because it's my county council. Feedback will be given at the end. I'm going to hand over to you now, Annie. It's all yours.
Good morning, everyone. So it's lovely to be here. And I'm going to talk to you about how our local planning authority has transitioned to implementing the new BNG framework introduced a year ago. So I just want to start with a reminder of the bigger picture, and that's that we're hopefully all here today because we want to use Biodiversity Net Gain to contribute towards restoring our natural environment in the wider sense. And I always like to try and bear that in mind when I'm delving down into some of the finer, more technical details of Biodiversity Net Gain. So for those of you who might not know Buckinghamshire, we became a unitary authority in 2020, combining 5 districts. We are a large local authority, we're landlocked, and we have high levels of growth planned. You could probably split our area into kind of roughly 2 areas. So in the north, we've got quite large areas of flat farmland. And then in the south, we've got the rolling hills of the Chilterns, which includes the Chilterns National Landscape. We're quite lucky in that we have high level commitment in our corporate plan to protecting the natural environment. And we've also worked quite closely with our Natural Environment Partnership to develop how Biodiversity Net Gain will work here. And this, that in part is what led to myself and my colleagues being hired in 2021 to implement Biodiversity Net Gain. So we do also have ecology officers, but you'll see on the screen the staff ratios, but you should probably put that in context as in terms of the level of growth that we are anticipating here as well. Sorry, I've jumped a slide. Here we go. So as I'm sure you'll be aware, Biodiversity Net Gain is not new. If I remember correctly, it's been in the National Planning Policy Framework since 2012. So we've had Biodiversity Net Gain in our local policies since around 2019, and we adopted a Biodiversity Net Gain supplementary planning document in 2022. So what we've been doing this last year is transitioning to the new statutory framework, which does things a little bit differently to what many of us have been used to under policy. And this table here shows some of the differences between policy BNG and the statutory framework from the perspective of the local planning authority. So I suppose one key difference is the percent required, the level of biodiversity gain. So development now has to achieve 10% gain, whereas in policy it was any gain. There's also been a change to the exemption. So our policies didn't specify any particular exemptions, whereas now there's a clear list set out in the legislation as to which types of development are exempt. The validation requirements have also changed. So we didn't have any specific validation requirements under our local policy, but obviously the statutory BNG framework now requires planning applicants to submit a BNG statement and also the minimum information. In terms of decision making, there's been a few changes in how we would consider whether biodiversity net gain will be achieved. So under policy, we had a much greater emphasis on demonstrating how biodiversity net gain will be achieved prior to deciding an application. Whereas with the statutory BNG framework, we have the pre-commencement condition for a biodiversity gain plan. So at decision making, we need to be satisfied the plan is capable of being discharged, but we don't necessarily need to know all of the details of how. In terms of conditions and legal agreements, under policy biodiversity net gain, we were using them to secure the provision of biodiversity net gain, as well as the long-term management and monitoring of habitats. And under the statutory framework, because we now have the statutory condition, we're using conditions and legal agreements more to secure the long-term management of the habitat and the long-term monitoring. So post-decision, under policy, any discharge of obligations or conditions would have been very scheme specific, whereas now they are all required to discharge a biodiversity gain plan if they've come under the legislative framework. So how have we been implementing these changes? So internally, we have a biodiversity net gain working group, and we've involved colleagues from our planning teams, enforcement teams, legal teams, ecology teams, and then other technical specialists as necessary. We've produced several templates and guidance documents, some of which are for internal use and some which are on our website to help planning applicants. So these include our interim guidance on strategic significance. So this is needed within the biodiversity metric and is ahead of us adopting the local nature recovery strategy. We have published some soils guidance to help applicants understand when we might want the results of soil sampling to inform whether habitat proposals are suitable. And we've also worked with archaeology colleagues to produce some guidance on archaeology and biodiversity net gain. And that's on our website. So in terms of our internal procedures, the new framework has meant we've had to make quite a few decisions and get procedures in place. So this includes things such as making decisions about to what degree the minimum information is checked by our validation technicians. So our validation technicians aren't technical specialists, and that this is something that I think different local planning authorities have taken different approaches to. It's obviously very important to get the applications validated. We've also had to revisit our triggers for when to consult the technical specialists, so the ecology officers, with more planning applications now including biodiversity net gain than they may have previously included with ecology. We have also had to revisit what we are considering at the decision-making stage. And we've had to make decisions around how we will be securing significant biodiversity enhancement, so in terms of both on-site habitat proposals and also off-site. As part of our biodiversity net gain offering, we've also decided to offer a regulation service for biodiversity gain sites. So this is where we will enter a Section 106 agreement with the biodiversity gain site, which enables them to register their site on the National Biodiversity Gain Site Register and therefore sell their units to the market. This service has been used both by independent landowners, but also by developers who are planning ahead and purchasing biodiversity gain site lands to be able to provide the units for developments that they've got planned. By doing this, we've been able to ensure that habitat enhancement is remaining as local to the development as possible, and that we are getting the right habitats being created in the best places for nature's recovery in Buckinghamshire. So for those of you who are listening from the local planning authorities, one of the places I'd really recommend going to is if you're joining from local planning authorities, I'd recommend you check out the Planning Advisory Service. So the Planning Advisory Service, which is known as PAS, has got a public-facing webpage, which has got some really great advice for lots of frequently asked questions about biodiversity net gain, particularly in relation to planning applications. But they also host a forum, which is called Basecamp, which local planning authorities can join. And on there, ourselves and a lot of other local planning authorities have shared all their kind of guidance and templates, so things such as their Section 106 templates and internal procedure notes. So they're kind of freely available for people to use and adapt as necessary. They also run, and I think they're about twice monthly now, a series of drop-ins where you can call in and ask technical questions about biodiversity net gain to discuss with others on the call. Then they've also hosted a series of events on the different aspects of implementing biodiversity net gain within a local authority. And I believe if you go onto the forum, you can find the recordings of those on there as well. So, sorry, I've gone. There we go. If you're listening from the private sector and you're interested in good examples of getting biodiversity into your development scheme, I suppose my kind of key tips is that the schemes that we've seen that have managed to achieve biodiversity net gain within the site are those which have built biodiversity into the scheme from the start. So I'd like to stress that as a best practice principle, that when you're planning your development, it's really important right from the start to have a good understanding about what is currently on the site in terms of habitat and their restoration potential. Apologies. It also requires following the mitigation hierarchy, which I'm going to come on to in a moment. In terms of submitting the planning application, whilst the legislation only asks for a minimum level of information, it's actually in everyone's best interest to submit as much as you can at an earlier stage. And this enables you to engage with the local planning authority to both try and achieve as much biodiversity on site as possible, and also make sure that what you're proposing can be secured as is required in the best way. I would strongly recommend the use of local planning authorities pre-application services. So prior to submitting your application, they can usually advise on all ecology issues, but particularly biodiversity net gain. And I suppose my last key tip is please don't get stuck at the validation stage. So I mentioned earlier that where we now have these minimum information requirements to get an application validated, they're being checked by validation technicians. And we've had quite a number of applicants who've not made it, either not submitted the information to get their application validated or not made it clear to a non-technical specialist that the information is there. Right. So coming on to the biodiversity gain hierarchy. So this is one, I suppose, key element of achieving biodiversity net gain. It's a new hierarchy which has been set out within the legislation, and it is distinct to some of the others that we might be used to within best practice guidance. It's also one of the things that local planning authorities must consider when deciding whether your development scheme will be capable of meeting the biodiversity gain objective, so of whether you can achieve your 10% net gain. So it's really worth explaining how you have followed this within your application documents. And the first action is avoid. It's to avoid impacting any habitat which has higher than a medium or higher distinctiveness. And the distinctiveness is set within the biodiversity metric itself. So where you can't avoid everything, the next step in the hierarchy is to compensate first by enhancing on-site habitat. So this is where having a good understanding of the baseline and where there is potential for restoration is key. Only once you've explored opportunities to enhance existing habitat should you look at creating new habitat still on site, still within the red line boundary. And only once you've considered all those opportunities should you be looking to use offsets from off-site biodiversity gain sites for your development. And as a very last resort, which hopefully very few people will get to, is the purchase of biodiversity credits from the government. Right, so talking about the habitat enhancement and creation, we also strongly recommend using a habitat management and monitoring plans. So Natural England have got templates published on their website for habitat management and monitoring plans. And we would encourage you to use those templates. They should be used where there's significant proposals for significant ecological restoration, but can be for both on-site and off-site habitats. Another key thing is to make sure your proposals are achievable. And this is based on both the current site, so based on what's there currently, the baseline habitats, and also the likely management. So these things should both be considered when you're proposing your final habitat that you'll envisage will be there kind of after the establishment phase. I would also strongly urge you to put ecology first. So we'd much rather see both on-site and off-site schemes that have been led by putting the right habitat in the right place, so that are achieving the best outcomes for ecology, rather than trying to just get as many units as you can within the metric. And monitoring. So one thing the statutory framework has introduced is that monitoring is best practice, and monitoring is really important to ensure that these habitats are achieved and also managed for the full 30 years. So that brings me nicely back to the bigger picture where we started. And it's that when we're adding all these habitat enhancements together, whether they be small or larger areas of land, it's all adding up to equal a restored natural environment. So thank you for listening.
Hello everyone, and welcome back. We've got to celebrate Anne's presentation because she's got up to an audience of 201. It's amazing. Thank you ever so much for your presentation. Next, I'd like to introduce Alistair Law from the wonderful Vertical Meadows, founder and chief executive of creating rich biodiversity habitat in a pop-up environment. So Alistair, if you're there.
Yes, I think there's going to be a poll first. Hi, Michael. So I think there is maybe going to poll that will appear on people's screens. Yes.
Perfect. It's up in case you can't see it.
It'd be great to get everyone's thoughts on this, because I guess I'm probably the kind of elephant in the room, really, because I'm talking about temporary and we're talking about BNG, which is really a 30-year thing. So I'm really kind of intrigued, actually, how we deal with this kind of meanwhile time, which often is quite a long time. So I'll talk through a bit about what we do, but it'd be great to get your thoughts on whether, what you think is possible during this meanwhile space. And once this pops down.
Excellent. The poll is out there. People are asking questions. There we are.
Wow. Okay. So that's more or less, we think the construction phase can be really positive, and I totally agree. I think obviously that's even in the BNG hierarchy in terms of doing no harm and kind of prioritizing maintaining habitat. So great. I'll kind of fire into a bit about what we do, and I guess that's that. And okay. So just a brief introduction. Vertical Meadows is a spin out of Arup, where I've kind of spent a lot of my career, and it's really been about kind of shaping a better world, which is obviously Arup's philosophy, but really about supporting biodiversity, and that's kind of what gets me and the team out of bed in the morning. And Arup's been really supportive on this journey. I guess I go straight to this, and it's quite interesting because obviously I'm going to be talking about temporary, and for me, insects and invertebrates are really kind of, as we all know, the kind of hidden really, base of biodiversity. And I guess a lot of them, we all love a butterfly, but when we talk about kind of hoverflies and we talk about these sort of more unusual ones, people are really not kind of aware of them and not really appreciating their value. And for me, really, the work really has to be done, and it's about getting people to relook at nature and reappreciate all parts of it, not just the pretty ones. And I guess what inspires us is these lovely meadows, and these meadows are complex systems, and what we're trying to do is actually put back these complex systems in kind of urban environments, really. And I guess the kind of heart of this is we know all the stats on kind of biodiversity loss, but the kind of loss in meadows pretty much mirrors that and really demonstrates the value of these complex systems that we've kind of lost our kind of appreciation of as we move to much more sterile environments in cities. And what makes us special, I guess, at Vertical Meadows, that we grow from seed. We think the growing process and kind of taking people on that journey of plants coming to life, and I'll show you a few pictures, is really essential so people appreciate where nature comes from. Because for me, BNG only will become a real success actually when kind of culturally we shift to a kind of a real kind of recognition of the value of nature. And for us, kind of taking people on that journey is key. And I'm going to talk very much about kind of these pop-up. So that's our wrap kind of work. Whereas we do have a kind of a permanent solution for buildings as well, which is a kind of metal, non-combustible kind of system. My background being a facade engineer from Arup. And I guess it starts with the plants. And I guess that's what makes us totally unique, is the sorts of things that we're kind of growing on our walls. And this is quite exciting, and it's been a kind of a labor of love with lots of experts from the Wildlife Trust, Bug Life, and other academics, and kind of choosing the right species. And we do kind of mix it up to make sure it's truly local to kind of the kind of environment. But a lot of the things are kind of stuff that we see, but perhaps people don't see. Often people see these wildflowers as weeds, and again, this is part of what we see as a real appreciation. But I guess for me, the potential, I'm going to just show you this video, is captured
If enough
here.
meadow is planted, they'll create wildlife corridors throughout the city. Scarlett Weston is working with Alistair to build what she calls beelines, part of a larger network of corridors she's helping to develop across Great Britain.
Most species of solitary bee can only travel 300 meters. If they don't have a flower to land on, they will not have the energy to continue that flight. By having these stepping stones of wildflowers along the route, they can move through the landscape.
So it's just a very short video, but this idea of kind of creating networks through our cities is kind of it's not a new thing, but we think this kind of potential temporary spaces are kind of a missed opportunity to not kind of provide these pop-up networks. And that was our work with Bug Life, and they've been really great at kind of trying to advise. But we kind of imagine almost cities having these secondary temporary kind of parks that are appearing, and if they're dense enough, because we know construction is everywhere, it's just for me a lost opportunity. And before I kind of talk about what they kind of look like, we also think the data side is very key, and we've been playing with these acoustic monitors. We've been testing out eDNA on our walls to kind of understand. And for me, the kind of key thing is getting some data on it, and we're kind of looking at all the kind of latest techniques, as well as obviously traditional ecologist assessments. But yeah, I guess seasonality is key. That's all part of nature, and that's kind of what we kind of talk about. We also see a lot of benefits of the cooling of walls, and so these kind of multifaceted benefits of nature, which we talk obviously are very key about what's it actually going to do for people, but actually that the kind of temperature reduction side in cities is quite important, and almost this, if we can get people a holistic conversation about what nature does in cities, we think it's much more powerful. So it's less kind of binary and more holistic. And what we're seeing is, I mean, that previous slide showed a 7-degree difference between a standard kind of rendered wall versus a green wall in terms of surface temperature, and that's resulting in what you can see here, a 3 to 5 degree lop of the peak. So that's quite significant. And so again, it's using green infrastructure in a way that is useful. And we know cities were facing really strong kind of moments of heat island. And very, very simple is, I mean, our system's literally just a rollout mat. What's, I guess, interesting, it's made from recycled clothes. So it's all about kind of upcycling clothes. And then it just attaches straight to a hoarding. And we're very much about kind of making sure the embodied carbon is very low for temporary situations. And we've kind of tested it in different scenarios. This is kind of trying to bring a bit of street art into it, but I'll show you more about the kind of how it can be used elsewhere. But I guess question is also temporary greening beyond kind of BNG and the kind of benefits of it and kind of this maintaining habitat on site. Our question, well, and it links very much to the code of construction in London, for example. Many of the boroughs are forcing a greening of construction sites. And I say forcing, I think it's, I mean, I think we'd all rather see more nature on our construction sites than kind of just printed kind of advertising. So we think there's a kind of real opportunity there for kind of that. And obviously it's reinforced by some kind of guidance, well, compulsory requirements on construction sites. And I guess kind of on the kind of why, we kind of, as we move to biodiversity net gain, there's often this issue, especially on urban sites, and admittedly maybe your kind of baseline is much lower, but there's often pretty much a clearing of the site, which means the idea of biodiversity net gain, if you don't retain anything, hence the hierarchy in BNG, seems a bit lost. And in urban sites, you kind of see everything get removed and then stuff being put back. So I think we've got to kind of really look at it, and whether that's with our products or with other products, we need to just think, how do we maintain that continuity to give it some logic so we can have almost a dotted line and then an up rather than a complete removal. And as I said, this is kind of the materiality of our walls, but more excitingly, I guess, is seeing what they look like. And kind of this is on a construction site in central London, so it's quite an unusual thing when it arrives. People are like, what is this? And obviously we print text on it to kind of tell people what's happening. But what's, as I said, we think is really important is taking people on this journey where actually it arrives, there's kind of nothing there, people don't know what it is, and then people start to see these things grow. And this for me is almost like a science kind of demonstration of how plants grow, very similar to what we did as kids growing cress on cotton wool, and that kind of evolves through the season. So this was at the end of the kind of first year where you can see the wildflowers and the grasses sort of taken over, and kind of then the following year it kind of, the grasses died back a bit, and then kind of the wildflowers really took over. So we use a very wildflower rich mix in our walls, but it's incredible when, I mean, the kind of activity on this wall, from hummingbird, hawk's moth to So all sorts of hoverflies, bees, spiders, you name it, are really tangible as you walk past there. And for me, that's really exciting, seeing this kind of temporary objects becoming colonized. And the idea, as we said, is, as in the video, is trying to create these connected stepping stones through our cities. And yeah, I guess this is kind of just showing that kind of by growing in this seeded way, you avoid this kind of pre-growing of loads of plants off-site in greenhouses with all the embodied carbon and plastic associated to something that is literally made out of recycled clothes. We use seed paper inside it, and it sprouts. And I guess this wall was arrived on this bicycle, and that's for us quite exciting. Just sorry, it's flicked back through, but yeah, a 38-meter wall can be delivered on one bicycle, and we think that's kind of the real power of going back to the basics of seeds, and seeds being key. And just so you know, the provenance of our seeds, we kind of use Emmersgate seeds, and they advise us. And for us, that story of localness is very important. And you can kind of go through this, and I guess beyond the kind of lovely pictures, I mean, for us, one of the key projects we've done with Tower Hamlets, and this is part of their code of construction, is how do we take sites like this, so dense urban fabrics, this is in the middle of Whitechapel, and turn it into something quite remarkable. So it becomes not just a biodiversity resource, but also a community resource. So when I talk community, I think we should always think community is way more just than people. It's everything that lives, for me, around. And I think once we start recognizing that there is a symbiosis actually between the people, nature, and insects, and kind of those benefits, it's quite exciting. So you kind of take that kind of graffitied hoarding, you start adding this mat, and then again you kind of start this process of kind of growth, and people are kind of questioning it. And quite interesting, we had people graffitiing on the mats in the early days, and we're like, oh god, but what happened was, as you see from the next photos, the graffiti just disappears and it gets covered up. So it was quite exciting to see this transformation, and even the fly tipping in the local area kind of reduce significantly. And it kind of goes through the seasons from very early spring into kind of the kind of warmer moments, and you get all these people stopping, because this is not like any other living wall system out there, and that's the kind of really exciting thing. It's really a wild space. And I think for me, this is a community day, and you can see the colors on this wall. I think that's what, when we see nature is exuberant in spring, but in kind of winter it dies back. So at the moment, if you go and see it, it's kind of like a cut kind of lawn with a bit of kind of dormant plants. But when we cut it, we saw them out of insects, and we let the insects kind of walk off, and before we kind of collected the cuttings. But I think that was a real kind of key moment to say, actually, this does something. And also they're millipedes, that there's so much biodiversity that can actually colonize stuff like this, from slugs, you name it. And I think for us, that's very exciting. And I guess here's an example we did with Grosvenor on a cladding, but I think there's a huge potential for these, I'd say, wasted spaces, which are just covered in plastic or covered in kind of temporary communication. And if we can build this kind of network as bug life and stepping stones through our cities, we can add another park into our cities. And that is, for me, the kind of true potential. And I think we should look at everywhere, and whether that's using our system or anything, but we should just use it as this is an asset for our city. Let's not treat construction as a dead period between biodiversity before and biodiversity after. So I think that's it. So I think I'm on time. But yes. Thank you, Michael.
There we go, found the right button. That was absolutely inspirational. I love those pictures. It's something for us all to take in. See that as a huge opportunity of that sort of modular biodiversity infrastructure. Is absolutely fab. Next, I'd like to introduce the one and only Tom Butterworth, director over at ARUP. Tom, you there?
Yes, can you hear me okay?
There we are, I can hear you, wonderful.
I'm not sure I am the one and only. Apparently there's a wedding guitarist that also goes by Tom Butterworth that my daughter keeps telling me about, but that's not me. So what I want to do, thank you, Michael, and thank you, everybody. What I want to do is underline actually some of the points that we've already heard today, and draw out some specific elements, particularly around the on-site biodiversity. So we've heard some of the stuff around the temporary opportunities. I want to talk about the more long-term opportunities on site. So I think I should be able to move on to the next slide. Yes. Oh, so this you've already seen. It's quite a bit of text here, but we've actually already seen this in the earlier presentation around the biodiversity gain hierarchy. I'm just going to underline a couple of points here, not necessarily go through this in the detail because I don't want to repeat what's already been said. But this hierarchy was new when Biodiversity Net Gain came into force this time last year. And it sets out that we should be doing things on site first. Yes, avoiding and then looking to create and enhance on site, and then moving to make sure that we only move to offsite if we can't deliver on site. And as we've already heard, we need to set this out in our plans. How have we avoided impacts? How have we mitigated those impacts that we can't avoid? And then how have we worked to enhance and restore habitats on site? And then only then going to offsite. And there's quite a challenge there about the value of that from an ecological point of view and whether that's possible and so on. And I just want to draw out a few key points. The first is that something that Alistair's already referenced, delivering on site has a whole range of benefits, including supporting biodiversity. But cooling our cities, sustainable urban drainage, flood risk management, carbon capture and storage, and so on. All of these are really critical. In fact, there's more and more work coming out at the moment flagging that if we do not make our cities greener, they will not be resilient to climate change. So to make our buildings and our spaces we're creating resilient, we need to think about how we build in these green spaces. And just a couple of examples, we've heard some from Alistair already about the walls cooling areas. There was a study done a few years ago showing that green spaces in Victoria, in London, that's the BID, is the Business Improvement District, can both decrease flood risk and cool the city, decreasing by 5 degrees, up to 5 degrees in certain areas. And the piece of work, the red and yellow map on the other side of the screen, is a piece of work that Arup's done on urban heat island effect. And surprise, surprise, the areas that are yellow, cooler, are the green spaces and around our blue spaces as well. And so building out and growing those green spaces is going to be really important. And just to be clear, this is actually about saving people's lives under extreme heat events. Really, really important. Nature isn't the only part of this solution, but it's a critical part. Another way of looking at this, and I know there's loads of pressure on us to show how we're supporting growth, but it's very clear that these green spaces support our economies locally and nationally. And locally, there's some lovely examples, Glasgow Green, in supporting huge, significant increased revenue to that local area and shops and houses and development. That green actually sparked a whole load of investment into the area. And we've got other examples. This piece of work was done quite a few years ago now, was done with DEFRA, and really set out a whole load of examples about how these green spaces support our economy. Now, getting back to Biodiversity Net Gain, and this is a point that was made earlier that I think I just want to make sure that we really underline. It's really important we remember where we start within Biodiversity Net Gain. And I mean that in terms of the baseline, what you are starting with. And we've already heard that it's really critical that we assess that baseline. And I would suggest we assess it before you go anywhere near purchasing that piece of land for development. That will allow you to identify key areas to avoid. If it's got a whole load of woodland on it or a whole load of high distinctiveness habitat, do not buy it for development. It's much better to buy one that's going to be a lower value habitat elsewhere. The other piece of this baseline is that what we're aiming for is a 10% net gain against that baseline. We do not have to go to creating the maximum possible biodiversity unit score that we could possibly get. We need to get it right for the ecology, as we've already heard. but actually we need to get a 10% gain on that baseline. So if that baseline is something like this, very low quality from an ecological point of view, then actually that uplift is very doable. So targeting your developments into the sites where we're starting from a low value ecological site can be hugely impactful, and that and hugely important, and make biodiversity net gain incredibly deliverable. And that's true whether you're a local authority looking at land allocation or a developer looking at purchasing land for that development. And then when you start to set out the gains that you want to put in place, again, underlying a point that's already been made, make sure that what you're putting in place is deliverable. Let's not pretend that we're going to create lowland meadow or chalk grassland all over our development sites in the middle of our urban cities. We're going to create something that is, yes, fantastic, rich, diverse, and so on. But let's not aim for those very high distinctiveness habitats. Maybe don't aim for the high distinctiveness ones. Aim for something that's realistic and deliverable. And this needs to be deliverable over the long term. So this is some work that's done by Zach Tudor, and I think in Sheffield, fantastic work. You can see here that we can get some fantastic places in the middle of our urban environments, similar to what we've just been seeing with Alistair, but these are long-term. And actually, in this case, this isn't just providing fantastic green space. There's also places that are providing sustainable urban drainage. And I think there was one of the questions about, well, sustainable urban drainage counts for a very low score. I would encourage us to look at the actual habitat that we can create on that. And this is what it actually looks like, a really quite diverse meadow on the top of that. So if we get this right, we can actually get some really diverse and really important habitats in amongst our urban spaces. The other point is that for all of these sites, we used really low nutrient soils and actually waste from food industry, beet scrubbings and so on, to create the soils here. That means that we're minimizing the maintenance costs. So thinking about that long-term delivery is really critical. Yes, this is making sure that the designs don't create extra financial burdens on maintenance contract. That is really important. We're starting to see some organizations, some maintenance contractors pushing back and saying, no, we can't deliver that. Now, I'm sure that will expand as the expertise grows and the understanding grows of what we're looking for. But these types of things are incredibly deliverable, and we minimize maintenance over the long term and give a great score in biodiversity unit terms. I could go through lots of these pictures. There is absolutely a piece about communication here as well with the local community that's really critical. And so within this, there's information saying what we're doing here and why we're doing this. And you can see the quite structured difference between the path and the green space so that we get that communication really clear. Because in the winter, it won't look like a flat piece of grass. It will look a little bit more structured. That's actually really important for biodiversity, but communicating why we're doing that, and that it's not just that we haven't mown an area, that actually that this is an important part of the ecological cycle for our urban biodiversity is really important. So that communication and engagement with the local community is critical in this. A different example and a slightly different scale. So this is looking across London with a group called Wild West End, which was a whole load of landowners across London looking at what we might be able to do on some really small sites. Now, this is a local wildlife site. If we're lucky enough to have one that we can enhance, this was actually enhanced with support from local school and inputting what they wanted to see, which is a lovely example. But we don't always have the opportunity to create something like that. It might be that we need to think about our roofs, and let's not go for just a flat mat of on our roof of one species. Let's actually create some of this space. And these sandy bits are for those bees that we heard earlier can only travel 300 meters before they need another stop. They're nesting sites for these bees. I sometimes feel like that myself in terms of coffee shops, but this is really important in terms of creating this network across our urban area. And again, it doesn't have to be the whole street dug up to change it. We've got some really lovely examples of playing this out through pots and planters, and again creating spaces for solitary bees and for other species to use the create refugi for different species in the stone as well as in the structure that we're creating. So firstly, let's think about biodiversity net gain and people. That's sustainable urban drainage, the cooling the urban centre. That's really, really critical. It's really important that our green spaces are brought right into the centre of our cities. Cities are our newest ecosystems, and they need support to grow and flourish. Think about assessing the site before you get anywhere near buying it. Identify what habitats are on site. It doesn't take long to do. It can be a really quick assessment. It's a quick desk-based assessment, and you'll be able to avoid yourself the pain of finding out later that it's got a high-value habitat on the site. Remember, not spelt correctly, remember that where we start, that starting point is really important because we're trying to get a gain off the back of that. So it's really important that we assess that, we measure that gain appropriately, and that it's a comparative increase. It's not trying to aim for the top of the biodiversity net gain pyramid of valuable habitats. Let's go for what is right for that site and make it deliverable. Make sure that this is something that can be delivered over the long term. All scales of activities can be beneficial. We can count everything within this, from pots to landscapes, to green roofs, to places like this, to the walls and so on. Let's count it all and start talking about all of it. I think using BNG can be really useful to then target what you want out of that site. Do you want it to cool the city? Is it part of your sustainable urban drainage? That's really important in thinking about how you target the types of interventions you want. And then getting the design right means that you minimize both the costs up front in the development costs, maximize the benefits, but you can also minimize those ongoing costs for that development over time and the management over time. Working in partnership, and that Wild West End piece was a significant partnership. Working in partnership is really valuable here because very often your site will be part of a wider ecological network, part of a wider piece of work. And the Victoria Business Improvement District is another example where actually the individual sites don't necessarily deliver all of the benefits we want, but together they can provide huge opportunities. So working with your neighbours, working with the local authority to think about what else is happening in that local area can deliver multiple benefits. Really, really valuable. It's a shift in the way we work, but really valuable in actually transforming how we deliver positive outcomes for nature, climate, people. And of course, if none of that works, we go off-site. We've already flagged that that was the last step in that hierarchy. And going off-site, this is my favourite river in Devon, going off-site can be incredibly valuable. But then let's think about that ecological network. And let's be brave to think about how the biodiversity net gain can actually help us deliver the right outcome for ecology, right outcome for biodiversity, and not be too tied to specific trading rules. There's really clear requirements in the guidance that says that you can break those trading rules if it's appropriate. Now that if it's appropriate covers a whole range of things, of course, but let's get this right for ecology. It's really important. So I'm going to stop there. I think there's huge opportunities on site, and I'd encourage lots of questions to come in on what Alistair and I are trying to do on site. Thank you very much.
Well done, Tom. Absolutely inspirational. I fully agree with your statement on 300 mix for coffee. Just before we move to the next one, just say thank you to everyone putting your questions in so far. Do try and put them in the question tab and not the chat. That makes it easier for us to sort out the questions at the end. But we've already got loads of questions coming in, so thank you all, 209 of you. Next, we have Dr. Julia Baker, Technical Director of Nature Services from Mott MacDonald. You there?
Hi, Michael. I'm here.
Hey, all over to you now, boss.
Thank you very much. And thank you, everyone. Right, let's just check this works. So I'm going to be talking to you about our mandatory net gain guide. And I really want to highlight Faye. She was the best to work with, absolute best. And she had this idea when mandatory biodiversity net gain came out. And I don't know about you, but everyone was like, oh, what's the mitigation biodiversity gain hierarchy and what's on-site significant enhancement? It was a lot to take in. And we're chatting away and she just said, right, let's just have a guide. And she was not only the best person to work with, she has such a practical, solutions-focused mindset and a core belief about biodiversity net gain. So I just want to highlight Faye, because without Faye, this guide wouldn't have happened. And that was a how-to guide. It's not legal advice or technical detailed guidance, but it's a how-to, which I'm going to take you through right here and right now. One of the first things that we wanted to do is just kind of bullet point the key aspects of mandatory biodiversity net gain. So if you find yourself getting lost or getting caught up in the various government guidance or blogs, it just sets out some bullet points that you can navigate your way through and find those key terms and what they mean. And to point to that third bullet point there, which is really, if you're thinking, well, how do I make BNG work, is that third one. Biodiversity net gain habitats need suitable soils, environmental conditions, sufficient space to grow and establish, and resilient measures to buffer extreme weather events, as well as other considerations. It's a bit of a theme. We already heard from our brilliant speakers before me about make this feasible, make biodiversity net gain. That's right, Faye, you're brilliant. Make biodiversity net gain feasible, make it work. So it's really about adopting that design-led approach to achieve biodiversity net gain. That's going to be most efficient, that's going to be most effective, and it's really going to maximize those efficiencies in the design and implementation. So adopting a design-led approach to achieve biodiversity net gain, where the design, immediate aftercare, and long-term management of habitats are integrated into the development project, exactly what Tom was just talking about. Such efficiencies can be realised, and it depends on your project, but if you do have a BNG ecologist and a landscape architect, when they collaborate on biodiversity net gain from the earliest stage of the project, that's when you'll not only get the efficiencies and the ways of working, some pretty good BNG outcomes. The guide then goes through key stages of a project lifecycle, and we start off with pre-purchase and then even optioneering. And it takes you through what's called assessing the feasibility of biodiversity net gain. And this is it's not just an essential stage, but it's a really clever way to think through some things I'm going to talk about. So one is the key habitats to avoid. We know the mitigation hierarchy, the biodiversity gain hierarchy. Find them really, really early. Then it sets out how to find those key degraded habitats to enhance, which I'll come back to. Early thinking about how your biodiversity net gain design can support local nature recovery strategies. And this is the trick for anyone interested in business development, that early thinking about the material value of biodiversity net gain. Now, to come back to key degraded habitats to enhance, that photograph there, it was last week actually, one of our ecologists sent me this photograph and he was like, Julia, I'm buzzing. I've got this hedgerow, I've been looking at it, the condition's not great. I'm buzzing with ideas of how to enhance it through biodiversity net gain. He never had that before BNG. And he was absolutely buzzing with ideas. And certainly our team are now out, eyes on, where are those degraded habitats that they safeguard? And again, it's part of the development to enhance for biodiversity net gain. Oh, there we go. Right. So this is one of the best, not tricks, if you like. Well, it is a trick of the trade. So we've got a lovely rise of local nature recovery strategies, and we've got mandatory biodiversity net gain. If you're designed for biodiversity net gain that supports targets in local nature recovery strategies, you get more points. It's as simple as that. And it just makes business sense. For those working in the local nature recovery strategy, it's that really tricky moment, and we're working with a couple of responsible bodies about this, about where is the funding going to come from. And for those in biodiversity net gain, it just makes business sense. You're going to get more units, again, if it's got to be feasible and ecologically practical. But there's a fantastic join up there that I think, and that's the conversation that we need to have going forward. The other question that I get is, so Julia, how much is this BNG going to cost me? And there's always a certain judgment that comes with that. And of course, we need to cost BNG, and I'll absolutely help you with that. But my question is, how can Biodiversity Net Gain generate value for you? And that might be your business, or that might be that particular project. Then I'll cost that for you. And this is what habitats do. I mean, you could be creating Biodiversity Net Gain, that the greenery and the richness enriches people's lives, and that's part of your development. We all know the business benefits of that. Or you could be on a project where you've got Biodiversity Net Gain and you've got social value, and the join up between the two. We've got some fantastic projects going on, whether like community places to come together, supporting local friends of groups, and that join up between Biodiversity Net Gain and social value, again, it's fantastic for the project, and it amplifies the benefits of social value and Biodiversity Net Gain together. So let's have that conversation. What is the material value of Biodiversity Net Gain to your business, to your project? And then let's cost that. The guide then goes into designing Biodiversity Net Gain, and there is some like fundamental building blocks. I mean, don't get me started. So normally ecologists, we work in GIS. Then we have landscapes who work in CAD, that's absolutely fine. And then I might have an engineer who's working in BIM. I mean, just sorting out that digital data compatibility. Honestly, please just ask that question before it gets too late. We come back to the point that this is about designing wildlife rich habitats. So really thinking about soils, environmental conditions, and all those kind of things. And this isn't a question for every project, but it might be for your project, particularly on the larger ones. You do have to ask the question, who has design liability for BNG? Typically, the ecologist will run the biodiversity metric, but they're not producing the landscape design. So Biodiversity Net Gain isn't the problem, it's working out these questions too late in the day. And I just want to shout out, there are some amazing, fantastic Biodiversity Net Gain designs that are coming through that are generating those habitat units in ways that really work for nature, but in ways that are maximizing space. So that kind of sketch one on the left there, that was a site where we had this represented it really well. You know, we had the woodland and there was this root protection zone, no kind of operations. The BNG ecologists were like, well, I can grab that. We can get some lovely woodland edge habitats. So you get the units from the woodland edge habitats, fantastic. The middle one there, I've seen some great designs coming through about ditches, which for those who know the biodiversity metric, that gives you your watercourse units. And there's been some great work with increasing reed bed coverage within that. And that also gives you some habitat units, again, if it's ecologically feasible and with the right maintenance on board. And good old double hedgerows, there's some really lovely ways that you can do that. But my point being, we need to up the game for us in ecological consultancy. And I really want to make sure that this is a clear message, because the mandatory Biodiversity Net Gain requirement is one of, I think, the greatest challenges and opportunities for our ecological consultancy profession. And I do think we need to up the game. We need to up the game in the ways that we design, the advice that we give to developers in terms of really thinking about these long-term habitat creation and enhancements for 30 years. No one's asked us to do that before, so I completely understand the step change, but that's not an excuse not to meet that challenge. And again, shout out to some brilliant people working in this space. There's also a lovely join up between, we work on projects where the biodiversity team are really looking at species mitigation. And they're really close to that. You know, they're really close to what they're doing for bats, for dormice, or for water voles. And I always set up a little dump folder. Say, look, when you're thinking about your species mitigation, and maybe you're thinking about coming across local biodiversity action plan species, can you dump in there anything that you want BNG to do? Because if we can build on your mitigation and provide those year-round resources for target species, that's a win. And I got some fantastic ideas. It was last week on a project that we're working on. It was like, look, Julia, we're doing this for bats, but with BNG, you could build like the bat super highway. And it's giving ecologists that room to master plan for nature. And it's really building on the biodiversity mitigation. We do need additionality, absolutely, but it's just making sure that we are joined up, working efficiently and getting the most that we can for this. I used to work in construction, and the handover, I cannot emphasize this enough. So if you do anything, please make sure there's a dedicated handover. And that's walking around the site, that's making sure the GIS files are going over, that's people have really understood the biodiversity metric, what's retained, what's enhanced, what's created. And even from construction to maintenance, there's as-built metric calculations, it's really, really important, because the metric and biodiversity net gain has such a life. It might pass through our hands on through design, but for biodiversity net gain to work, that handover is really important. There's also the support for construction that I do want to raise, because, I mean, especially on large projects, everything changes when you get to construction. Things are delayed, things happen. But now that delay between habitat clearance and landscaping might trigger the need for an updated metric. And if it goes over a year, you might need more BNG. And it's really making sure that if we are in design, that's our responsibility to take our construction colleagues through that process and make sure we hand that over. So the guidance is hopefully pretty, I mean, I really like the layout, and thank you for everyone who worked behind this, as well as Faye myself. It's got a what, a key lead, and a why. Now, we've tried to make this as generic to apply for as many people as possible, but also to list it as a checklist. So you might think, well, that's not the point, that really doesn't work for me, but that one does. So it's a way to make sure that if you're finding yourself kind of wading through the ins and outs of managing net gain, and quite lost from the fact that this is about creating habitats for wildlife, for people, and that is of such value to us as a business, it just takes you through all the good things that you can do. And the final point, as we reach day one, I don't know if anyone remembers this time last year. Oh no, I just loved it. LinkedIn was awash with Happy BNG Day. Do you remember all those messages? And there wasn't just hope, it was belief that our biodiversity net gain, that the recognition of nature was finally here, within our infrastructure industry. But now there is a conversation that I think we need to have, because I think the binary, has biodiversity net gain been successful or failure? I don't think that's very helpful, because actually it's just a journey, and it's a series of steps that we need to map out, and we need to think about continuous improvement every single step in the way. Because the next conversation is really linking with local nature recovery strategies. We need to up the game in terms of that, how do we get value for your business and biodiversity net gain? Because if we do, there will be that recognition and intent to do biodiversity net gain right. I think there's a lovely place, and I was really inspired by the first speaker actually. There's a really lovely place to think about biodiversity net gain within placemaking, within local plans. Actually, shout out to what Tom was talking about about the BNG and the climate resilience, and we're working on that behind the scenes actually, so hopefully more to come this year. But also, as we move up the steps towards that, biodiversity net gain is then the foundation for our infrastructure industry to drive and support nature recovery and enhancement. It's only one of a package of measures where that vision, where we can all stand proud on the way that infrastructure is truly supporting nature's recovery and enhancement, has come through. But it's a package of measures, and it's a foundation. So I just encourage you to think about, this is the steps along the way. You can call it a roadmap or journey, I don't mind, but it's a continuum. And there's a long road ahead, but if we work together, and if we collaborate, and we work together as one community, we'll definitely get there. Thank you.
Sorry, I tried to find the button again. I couldn't find it for a second, so I do apologise. Julia, absolute wonderful presentation as usual. Thank you ever so much. We've got more questions flowing in. Thank you again to the crowd. Next speaker, we're slightly ahead of time, is the one and only Dr. Nick White from Natural England. I'm going to hand over to you if you're on, sir.
I am indeed, Michael. And Lovely to see you all as well. And there's a poll, actually. I'd be really interested in the audience's views, your experience of Biodiversity Net Gain. Today is the kind of first year anniversary of BNG, as Julia was just kind of talking about then. So for those of you who've had experience or engagement with mandatory BNG since the commencement, I would just be interested in how's that experience been for you? A couple of minutes for the people to respond. Waiting for the big reveal. Okay, so we've got kind of 50% neutral, 34% positive, 14% negative. I don't think that's necessarily that's surprising, actually, either, because I think there's been some fantastic outcomes, fantastic achievements from Biodiversity Net Gain. We've been hearing about some of that this morning, but there are some challenges as well, and I'll come on to some of those in the course of the presentation. But if I just get the slides up. So what I wanted to do, though, was to start off by saying, going back in time a little bit. Why do we think that Biodiversity Net Gain, a mandatory approach, is something that would be needed in England, and kind of what was the context for it? So we live in the most nature depleted country in Europe, possibly in the kind of wider world. Kind of species abundance figures have been continuing to go down, and that's not a good outcome. That's not a place. That's not a good place for us. It's not a good place for nature, clearly, either. And we also were in a period of time where there was a really polarized debate around nature. It was very often characterized as, well, you could have development or you could have nature. You can't have both. I think that's a fundamentally flawed kind of argument, but that was very much the way that the kind of debate was being characterized at the time as well. There were some kind of fantastic development schemes coming forward, many of which were kind of members of the kind of wider kind of CIRIA partnership, who had nature at the heart, but it was really difficult for them to try and articulate and demonstrate kind of what they were doing for nature, because many developments weren't doing anything for nature either. So it became a really contested and subjective space. There was no particularly way of being able to demonstrate whether you're having a positive impact on nature or not. And that was both to your stakeholders, the kind of residents, customers, but also internally within businesses, little way of actually being able to demonstrate that. We also had a lot of inequality in access to green space and blue spaces across the country. Some communities are very well served. Some, typically poorer communities, are very poorly served in terms of access to that. At the same time, nature itself was being kind of left to a dwindling number of kind of quite isolated sites with very little ecological connectivity across the kind of wider landscape, and less money going into nature from government, and very reliant still on the kind of public purse to try and kind of invest in nature recovery. But that investment was declining over time. There were exceptions to that, but that often was the kind of the picture across the country in terms of how nature was thought about within planning. But then also how nature was considered within development process wasn't necessarily a good story either. Again, exceptions, but all too often, nature was an afterthought. It was a thing that was thought out about right before you submitted your kind of very detailed proposal to planning for approval. So the colleges would be brought in, they'd have a worked up design, they were faced with very little opportunity to meaningfully influence that in any shape or form, but would try their best. There would be some pretty schematics and pretty pictures sent to planning committees. The nature that was proposed would then often get value engineered out once permission had been received. And no one really was thinking about longer term management or maintenance. So often the kind of greenery in and around developments would be failing within a kind of matter of years as well, because no maintenance was being undertaken. And there was very little knowledge of nature amongst the kind of contracting community who was undertaking some of that kind of maintenance, and no real join up between professions either. So nature really wasn't being thought of either within planning or within development very well. There were exceptions to that, but all too often this was the picture. So this was the context and the background that BNG was trying to challenge and to try and flip, essentially. So it had as a policy 3 ambitions, one of which is, firstly, it's biodiversity net gain. It's a nature benefit. So it's looking to try and reinforce the mitigation hierarchy. So to get away from that approach where sites were being completely cleared of any nature on them and look to try and work with nature that's there and reinforce that mitigation hierarchy, whilst also contributing to wider nature recovery. But Tom very eloquently made the point about the importance of people and communities, and people is a key aspect of BNG. This as well is that the ability that we know that nature can deliver to all of us in terms of our health and well-being, improving the resilience of communities, creating nicer places in which to live and work. So delivering those people benefits was another kind of key aspect of BNG. And then lastly, to improve the process, to make it a much more objective process rather than a subjective, to try and standardize things, having a standardized metric, a more standardized approach, hopefully then to try and de-risk the development process from the developer's perspective as well. So if you've got a sensible, well-thought, well-designed scheme, there should be less objections coming forward to that. So the ambitions. And then we had the kind of legal requirements itself. I won't dwell on this. I think everyone's probably hopefully quite familiar with these now, with the kind of mandatory requirement. And obviously we're now at the point where we've got we're 1 year in as well for major developments under the Town and Country Planning Act. One thing to highlight is there were exemptions, though, to biodiversity net gain. They were there from the outset, and sometimes people get surprised by some of the statistics around exemptions. I think bear in mind, firstly, that the biggest volume of planning applications by a country mile almost are household applications. Yeah, URI submitting applications for kind of loft extensions or things like that, and they've always been exempt from BNG. They're not covered. But there were some other ones as well around custom and self builds. Also, an exemption for de minimis schemes. So if you're not having an impact on habitat of significance, so for example, if you're putting up signage or things like that, got small scale interventions, those too are exempt. So between those, actually, that's a lot of planning applications. That's a lot of the kind of routine work that goes through planning departments. So don't be surprised if you see statistics saying, as you know, we've got the data out now, and the kind of 75% of applicants aren't doing BNG, but that's not surprising. It was never expected that they would be. But what is important is the trend data for exemptions is coming down. We did at the start of BNG see a lot of, I think, confusion around what some of the exemptions were, both by developers and by planning authorities. But we've seen the use of exemptions starting to come down as the system kind of settles in as well. And obviously permitted developments are exempt too. But smaller schemes generally weren't, and there were some, and I'll kind of come back to smaller developments in a bit, but there were some specific kind of products made available to them to try and help simplify the BNG process, one of which was, and it's arguably slightly misleadingly named, the small sites metric, probably better described as a low risk metric, which is where actually if you've got a site that's got little kind of pre-existing nature value, you don't necessarily need, we don't need an ecologist to use the metric to value that site and assess it. Equally, planning authorities do not need to get an ecologist to check that. These by definition are low risk sites as well. So a tool available for those, and then also a simplified version of the habitat management monitoring plan that we've heard talked about earlier on. So again, the policy emphasised, as we've been hearing about, delivery on site in the first instance, and this is through the biodiversity gain hierarchy, through better quality landscaping, green infrastructure. It was always envisaged that the majority of schemes would be able to fully meet BNG within their red line boundary, i.e. on site, and that's proving to be the case as well. Most schemes are. But there are always instances where that won't be possible, either for practical reasons, the site's very small, quite constrained, or where the ecology in question, it's just not possible to integrate that in a sensible way, going to the point being made earlier, to make sure what's being proposed is actually deliverable within the context of a development site, say with lots of people and their pets nearby. And that's where the offsite delivery again comes into play, and again looking to have that local where that's possible, where they've got land available, but it could be anywhere in England. And then the third option is this statutory biodiversity credit scheme, which is deliberately the most expensive, but has always been there to ensure no development is in a position where they can't legally meet the net gain requirement. It was always envisaged that there would be very low levels of statutory biodiversity credits sold, and so far that's proving to be the case as well. There have been sales, but they're kind of at low levels of that. Most people are achieving BNG on site or a combination of that, or through the purchase of offsite units. And where people are delivering offsite, they need to use and purchase units that are capable of being registered or have been registered. A planning authority legally can't approve a game plan and allow the development to start building unless anything offsite is on the net gain register. And it plays a really important part of BNG. It's there to provide transparency and integrity to the offsite scheme. So yeah, you or I can track through, see where developments, see what developments offsite delivery, where is that happening, who owns the land, what's being done. It also makes sure it keeps landowners honest as well, so they're unable to keep selling the same units to multiple different developers. So it's an important part of the biodiversity gain system, and I'll come back in a minute to talk about what we're seeing in terms of the levels of activity offsite and the emergence of the offsite market. So what are my reflections on BNG in terms of thinking about design now? And some of these points have already been picked out in some of the earlier presentations, but contrasting with what was all too often the case with development before, with what we're seeing now. So firstly, we're seeing an increased shift of people really thinking about BNG right from the very outset at site selection, at outline design stage, because it's definitely true that if you've got a site that's got a lot of high value nature on it already, you're going to struggle to achieve a biodiversity net gain outcome on that site. You're going to have to go off site. So people are paying more attention to what's on the land in the first instance. And one of the things in the chat I know was a point about open mosaic habitats on brownfield sites. Firstly, I think important to stress, being a brownfield doesn't mean a site is automatically open mosaic. Most brownfield sites aren't, but there are instances where you do have that really high value brownfield habitat called open mosaic habitat. And so what we've been looking to do is to try and find ways to help developers who have encountered that, where there are no offsite open mosaic habitat units available, to use the rule 4 within the metric to come up with locally appropriate solutions for that habitat as well. But the main thing is thinking about your what's on the site in the first place, and how to kind of think about nature in that context. Secondly, we're seeing net gain really starting to seriously reinforce the mitigation hierarchy. Gone are the days where people would just take a site, clear everything that was there, build, and then look to try and perhaps put some greenery back in. It's a disastrous strategy for biodiversity net gain. The more you can work with the habitats you've got on site, particularly if you've got opportunities to enhance aspects of those, the easier you'll find biodiversity net gain to achieve. Annie made the point earlier, this is something that planning authorities will be looking for evidence that this is what you've been doing, and you'll find it easier just in terms of the metric and biodiversity uplift to get points essentially by enhancing habitats and starting from scratch. I think it's also leading to much more collaboration and much earlier collaboration between different professions, particularly ecologists, landscape architects, engineers, architects as well themselves, to kind of co-create, co-design places that have got nature kind of woven into them as well, but done sensibly as well. Be realistic about what's possible and what's not possible. But the really radical change, I think, is this long-term management. People now really thinking and having to think about long-term management and maintenance, real upskilling of that kind of sector as well. So really high quality kind of actors now in the kind of estates management space, who are very aware of kind of their responsibilities to manage and maintain these, and having conversations, bringing those into discussions early as to what might be an appropriate design, a solution for a site. I think is really key, because they're the ones that are going going to be having to deliver these outcomes. And sensibly, you know, they're saying if actually that's what you're proposing can't be delivered, they won't engage with you. So, you know, bring them in and make sure what is being proposed on site can actually be delivered. But we're also seeing activity offsite as well. So there were some, this was a slow burn, if you like, in terms of when biodiversity first came out. The register was launched on day one. It took a while for land to actually start to appear as kind of offsite agreements, offsite land rather, for BNG. Some of that was down to issues and difficulties of obtaining legal agreements on behalf of landowners. And that's starting to unblock. There's now, you know, increasing numbers of planning authorities offering Section 106 agreements to landowners, and you've got kind of, I think now 21 responsible bodies able to enter into or offer conservation covenants to landowners as well. So there's more and more availability of legal agreements and kind of templates being provided as well. So that legal process is speeding up. There are also some people have encountered delays in terms of being able to get proof of ownership from the land registry, and you need to demonstrate you own the land. So this is something that the register itself has recognised, and so slightly kind of changed the requirements to demonstrate the information you need to provide, recognising that it isn't always easy to get proof of ownership quickly from the land registry. So where we are now is we're at a point in February of this year where we've got over kind of 43 sites now on the register. There's more being onboarded on a weekly basis. So that's over 1,200 hectares of land that's being put aside for nature that wouldn't have been put aside for nature had it not been for Biodiversity Net Gain. And this isn't land that's being taken out of food production either. The example of this on the screen, the kind of farmers under the Allwood Farm Habitat Bank image. So that's a habitat bank in Wigan, just outside Manchester. It's land that was becoming economically unviable for them to continue farming. It was over some former collieries. It was prone to subsidence. It was flooding a lot. They were going to have to leave their farm, which had been in their ownership for generations. But Biodiversity Net Gain provides them with an opportunity to get an income instead from nature. It's helping keep them on the land, keep that community alive as well. So again, it provides not just nature benefits, but again, another aspect of the kind of people benefits. I think there's more that can be done to further encourage offsite provision, because we do want it where possible to be local to the development site as well, so that the kind of benefits of biodiversity net gain can be kept local. And there's a key role that local authorities and sectors actually can provide in that, in terms of making more data available around what's the future demand for development going to be within a particular place. And where's that development going to happen as well? So what habitats is it likely to affect? That gives landowners critical information to know what sort of habitats they need to provide locally as well to meet that demand. So the more information that we can see being provided in that space, that's really helpful. And I know there's just been a report published today actually looking at kind of habitat availability and pricing, and that's really welcome. We can also look at how we can integrate biodiversity net gain in a way that can deliver wider benefits as well. So these off-site and on-site habitats, delivering outcomes that can deliver kind of resilience, etc. And then just lastly, the scale of the market is increasing. It's bringing in new income streams for landowners, delivering wider benefits. It's also leading to a whole increase of interest in technology and the use of technology, and nature tech and the UK at the heart of that, off the back of biodiversity net gain, is really starting to gain traction, not just in this country but abroad. And also the biodiversity metric developed here, we're now seeing going global as well. So I've just seen Michael pop up, so I shall bring myself to a close. BNG is not a silver bullet, was never intended to be one, but it is definitely delivering better outcomes than we were getting before for nature. And that's it for me.
Thank you very much, Nick. A wonderful, wonderful presentation. And it's really insightful to see where we've come from over the last 12 months. Some huge benefits there for all. Next, we have Helen, and again, apologize for mispronouncing your surname, Nalu.
It was close. You got it right the first time, actually, Helen Newell. So thank you, Michael. You didn't need to explain it again. But yes, thank you for that.
You're the group head of biodiversity at Barratt Developments.
Yes, at Redrow now. Yeah.
So over to you. The floor.
Thank you very much. Thank you. So good morning, everybody. I am going to give you a brief presentation on the delivery of net gain, biodiversity net gain and high density development, and some thoughts regards its delivery. I'm going to say brief because actually you'll have heard a lot of what I'm going to say from the previous presenters and their amazing presentations. But that means two things. One is that actually the points we're all making are key to biodiversity net gain and key points to take away. Also means that actually I'm saying the right things. That's also quite a comfort for me. One of the key terms I think I'm going to be taking away is actually from Julia's presentation. So thank you for this, Julia. I might use it again. But this master planning for nature, I think, is a really important point to think about going forward. So initially, I'm just going to quickly talk around what we mean by a high density development. They're usually urban in nature and either multi-story or more flatted developments, but fundamentally they've got limited public open space with which to play with. They're not like potentially a greenfield development where you may have a lot more open space that goes with a development. These can be quite constrained and come with a lot of other issues that potentially haven't or don't need to be considered when you're looking at some of the more traditional kind of rural or greenfield developments. At Barratt Redrow, we've got a number of divisions. We've got 29 divisions, and some of those overlap with large cities and big towns where space is often at a premium. And obviously, none of these spaces, none of these developments are exempt from the biodiversity net gain requirement. Nick very eloquently talked about those exemptions, and here we wouldn't be coming up against any of those. And if we're to consider that there are a lot of people in these urban areas and that access to green space is limited, makes the biodiversity net gain process actually a much more important thing to have in place to be able to demonstrate an uplift in the amount of green infrastructure that we are creating than was there in the first place. So the rest of this presentation is really going to highlight some of those key things to think about when you're delivering biodiversity net gain in these types of development. First thing to consider here is that the process is still the same. We are still looking to measure that biodiversity baseline. We're still looking to use a biodiversity metric, whether it's a statutory metric or the small sites metric. We need to understand what the value of the habitat is when we first start out. And we need to consider and build biodiversity net gain into the start of any design process. It doesn't matter where you are. It's how are we going to understand what's there in the first place and then put back more than what we started out with. The mitigation hierarchy has been talked about a lot during this webinar, and that's because it is a fundamental principle of how you actually go about delivering biodiversity net gain, no matter what the context is. The images you've got on your screen here in the presentation, this is one of our sites. It was actually the old Nestle factory in London. We now call it Hayes Village. It was one of the early, very early assessments, biodiversity net gain assessments that we ever did on this when we started out. It was about 2019. And so it was a very, very early biodiversity metric that we were using at that time as well. But you can see from this stand of trees, when we plugged that into the calculator and looked at how much biodiversity value was in that, we recognized that by avoiding that stand of trees, we actually managed to increase the uplift in biodiversity net gain at that site significantly. So if we'd removed it, obviously there would be a massive loss of biodiversity at that site. So avoidance is really key in that first step in the mitigation hierarchy. Not only that, we're not only just looking at this from a biodiversity perspective, actually, we've now created quite a mature landscape in an area that would have been, that we would be looking at starting landscaping from scratch. So all of a sudden we're building around what is already quite a nice and mature landscape to move into. And although we know this doesn't actually increase house prices, we do know that it helps us to sell houses a lot faster if we're able to provide that sort of environment for people to move into. The other thing to consider is implementation. I know implementation is key wherever you go and whichever context you're using it, but here, it's the timing of this is especially important, especially when you're creating podium gardens on top of high-rise developments. So those trees that you see in these images will have had to have been craned in to the development, and cranes can't just be brought in at the drop of the hat. So there needs to be this idea that the timing of when these trees are brought in, when the cranes are in place, and how they're going to be stored on site to maintain their health before they may even get planted into the ground is really important. And this is also an important point to consider if you've ever thought of doing what we call contract growing. So making sure that if we are trying to contract the growth of certain trees, that those are going to be ready and available for when and at the right size, because the biodiversity metric has taken into account the size of those trees when they're planted. So we need to make sure that those things are all in place as well. Also, structural loads have been considered prior to the landscaping going in. So that landscaping can't be shifted around once the ideas of where the trees are going to be put and where the beds are going to be and where the water features are going to be. That all has to be done and understood alongside the structural engineering of those developments. And the other point to take into account here is these extreme environmental conditions. Environmental conditions will vary massively within these developments because you'll have some areas that are in shade a lot of the time. You'll have some areas that are in full sunlight. And if you've ever stood at on top of one of these buildings, you'll know that some of the wind speeds up there can be quite fast as well. So thinking about drought-tolerant species that can survive in shade and extreme sunlight, or a variety of those, potentially even low-growing species as well. All of these things need to be considered when you're looking at developing habitats on these sorts of developments. Given the extremes of the conditions, it feels even more important to ensure that these soft landscapes and these hard structures also provide for climate change mitigation. Now, we've talked a lot already about what some of those benefits are of these landscaping types within the urban environment to reduce the urban heat island effect, obviously to help filter out some of those pollutants as well, and slow the flow of water off these hard landscaped areas so that our drains aren't becoming overloaded when we have flooding during high rainfall events as well. So if we get this right, and we're helping to manage those, we're then helping to manage those direct and indirect impacts associated with these developments, hopefully for the lifetime of those developments as well. And yeah, you were in an urban environment. These places are going to be very heavily used spaces, places for people. That's ultimately what we're designing here. They're going to be heavily used. So we need to temper what our biodiversity net gain aspirations are going to be accordingly. They need to be realistic. They need to be deliverable. And it's already been identified earlier on that we don't just mean deliverable for then and there when they go in, but for that long term, that management piece. How are we going to manage these habitats in these specific spaces? So if you're thinking about creating wildflower meadow, maybe 5-7 floors up, how are you going to get a mower on there? What are you going to do with the arisings? It's those sorts of things that really need to be considered when you start thinking about biodiversity net gain in these spaces. It would be remiss of me not to mention the importance of biodiverse roofs, green or brown roofs in urban areas. They are an absolute lifeline to invertebrates and birds. They help with climate change adaptation and mitigation through cooling, reducing the flows of water, potentially even helping to reduce energy use in some of those buildings as well. So yeah, and a lot has already been said about green roofs, and these are just a couple of examples from ours and from a site over in Cambridge. It's great to be able to look down on these and see the sea of greenery on some of the roofs of our buildings as well. So I think the point here is that where we've got in some urban spaces where there was no biodiversity value there in the first place, it's really easy to claim an uplift in biodiversity, sometimes up into the thousands of percent. We have seen some of these metrics being done where you're looking at, a ridiculous number of percentage increase. But that percentage increase may only equate to 1 or 2 biodiversity units, and we have to think about it in that regard. But what those 1 or 2 biodiversity units are actually providing is massive. It's massive, not in terms of biodiversity uplift in your metric, but in terms of the benefit and the services that it's providing to people and biodiversity. And also, as discussed earlier, the wider environment from a climate change impact. And on top of that, these spaces can also bring communities together if designed well. Communities really do coalesce around these open areas, these natural spaces. So having biodiversity net gain as a goal in these urban contexts can deliver multifunctional spaces with many benefits as well. And I think I'm out of time, so I'm going to leave it there.
Helen, that was a wonderful conversation there. If I could ask all our panel members who've done presentations, just pop your cameras on, that'd be great. So we're just going to enter the Q&A now, and hopefully we'll be able to pull that through. So, apologize to the crowd, I'm not the best on Zoom, so I'm still learning. We've got the most likely one being, what percentage of planet applications use off-site BNG units? What's the market like, and where do you see demand going? Who would like to take that one? Tom, you're smiling too much, it's yours.
I think Nick, did you put your hand up? Because
I did, but go for it.
I'll follow you. No, I'll follow you. You go first and I'll follow you. Let's hear I'd love to hear your thoughts.
So it's roughly running, I mean, the predictions where it would be about 75% delivery on site, the residual off site. Currently slightly higher percentage on site at the moment, but bear in mind, we're still talking about relatively low volumes because most developments that were subject to mandatory BNG haven't actually got to the point of needing to start creating habitats as well. So, so those stats could change, but roughly where we estimated they would be.
And Tom?
So a couple of quick points. We are very, very early days in this and the market's growing, but let's be realistic. What BNG is actually doing is addressing the impacts from development. If we get most of that delivered on site, which is the right outcome for people, for the local biodiversity, then actually that market isn't going to be massive everywhere. The other piece is the second point is that as this market develops, we'll start to see habitat banks, and that will make this both more efficient and cheaper. And there's a huge opportunity there for local authorities to step into that place and help enable that to happen. And we saw in some of the pilots 10 years ago, local authorities proactively working with partners to develop fantastic areas for nature that the developers could then come in and contribute to making that development easier for them and delivering the right outcome for the local people and biodiversity. And the last point is that we're expecting this to come through as a legal requirement for national infrastructure projects. And that's where I think we'll see this market pick up a little bit, because those will need to deliver wider offsite gains. And that will actually help all the rest of us doing developments because it creates that market movement.
Thank you very much, Tom. Anyone else from the panel wants to chip in before we move on to the next one? Excellent. I'm just going to call it Alistair. There's a number of these talking about your vertical walls. So if you could go through the Q&A, we'll try and lump them all in together for you, if that's okay.
Yeah, no, I had a look. I think one of the key points made was what happens at the end of it. What do you do with it? And do they have a so currently what we do is we reuse all the irrigation kit, and we have been trying to develop a biodegradable version of our mat using we use recycled polyester clothes because that immediately gives the longevity, but we're also conscious that people would like to reuse it in a green roof in the final development. So we are working on that, and we have tried a biodegradable version, but we're having issues with speed of biodegrading because sometimes sites are there for 2 years and sometimes sites are there for kind of a year, and so or 3 or 4. So yeah, with this question of when it falls apart and goes into the ground is something we're working on. But we typically, we always use all the infrastructure, all the pipework, all the irrigation systems are reused. So it's just the recycle bit. And just to give you a context of embodied carbon, the embodied carbon of that is about 1/10 of these dye bond panels that people stick on hoardings. So that's the kind of context that, yeah, we're 1/10 of these aluminium sort of panels. So, and then there was a question about, I saw a question about kind of habitat and continuity of habitat. So this is something we've discussed a lot with bug life and wildlife trusts, of making sure that there is continuity. And we have deliberately targeted species with much shorter lives in terms of, so insects, they can be anything from a day to weeks there's a few that get over winter. So when we do cut it, we do make sure all the biodiversity there moves on. But our kind of model really is from that video of that actually we're creating this network. So ideally there'll be pop-ups around it. So that's for me success, is actually if it becomes a legislative requirement that every construction site has to support nature in a certain way, then you've got a constant habitat bank moving around our cities. So that's how we see it. I don't know if there's any other question.
I think that's a great answer, Alison. It's quite interesting, this sort of modular biodiversity piece of work you're doing and seeing where it can lead to in the future.
Yeah, and I think, it's very much about education, getting people to see nature. And I think Tom talked about it in his bit, is like nature isn't perfect during winter, but the moment we see these planters, which have to be perfect all year round, then you kind of lose that actually when there's a stalk there, it's maybe got insects kind of inside them, and that's good. And rather than that's messy. And I think we've got I think for us, I think this is really a big cultural movement. And I realize that, like what Helen was saying, what we're doing locally might not be huge. It's not going to solve the whole biodiversity issue. But I do feel, and this is what we do with the Crown Estate, is that they have a lot of people walking, 70 million people through their estate. So if we can start people kind of noticing nature and treating it differently, then we make better choices, which hopefully then will reflect in kind of BNG kind of outcomes.
Thank you, Alison. I fully agree on everything you said there. Next question to the panel. I'd welcome the panel's thoughts on nature-based SUDs. The BNG matrix groups all SUDs under habitat, which has a very low score, when we believe incorporating rain gardens and swales examples have important ecological functions, not just water management. Thoughts, panel? Nick?
I'm sure others will have thoughts on this one as well. But the first thing to say is, so the metric gives an average kind of value for all habitats in it. If you are of the view ecologically that actually what you're looking at is much better value than what is suggested in the metric, you can always say, actually, I'm going to record this as a slightly better value habitat and explain in the metric notes why you've done that. The planning authority agrees with you. That's a perfectly legitimate thing. There's also wider work going on within as part of the metric team, conversations with Sustrain specifically around SUDs and how they're kind of recorded in the metric. So this is a constantly evolving piece. Design of SUDs, design of all habitats, green walls, roofs, etc. It's constantly evolving, constantly changing. So the metric's not going to stay static in terms of how it values things in perpetuity. It will continually get reviewed. But yeah, it already allows you that flexibility though. So if you think what you've got in front of you is more valuable than is being suggested, record it as a more valuable thing, provided the planning authority is quite happy to agree with you on that.
Thank you, Nick. Tom?
Very quickly, just to add to that, I think it's important to note that the some of those urban categories are not based on the habitat; they're based on the function or the space, the green wall as opposed to green roof. And actually, we can go in and assess them based on the ecology, as we would for some of our other grasslands, woodlands, etc., and get a different view, which is exactly what Nick's talking to there. So this is an evolving space. If we assess it on the ecology and that sustainable urban drainage that I showed, which I think is far better than a low distinctiveness habitat, in my view, we'd go out and assess it from the ecology and tell that story and make that case. And I think there's a really strong case to be made there. So I think that the gift, the power is in our hands to demonstrate what's possible on these sites.
Really good. Thank you very much, Tom. Okay, general question. How big a risk is it that the government pulls BNG and the private marketplace and replaces it with a central fund, as it could be viewed as impeding the house building agenda? I think that's an interesting one for Helen and Nick, of course.
First, Helen?
Yeah, I guess I think we've got to remember the fundamental principles around biodiversity net gain at this point. You know, we do need to have key understanding that the mitigation hierarchy, the gain hierarchy, has been legislated and it needs to be applied. However, a nature fund is definitely a great way to try and assist those with, you know, who may be struggling to find portions of biodiversity units in an off-site market. I think there's a space for all of this, and we need to be cognizant of what the biodiversity net gain process is trying to do, which has been reiterated a number of times here. It's around protecting and enhancing biodiversity in and around developments, and just having a nature fund as a sole means to manage that, I don't think would be an appropriate way to deliver it. Nick?
Yeah, so we know that biodiversity net gain can work with development. It's there. It's been tested, if you like, for many years around that. And we've got a government that's clearly got a kind of an agenda around growth and house building, and going to personally support that, just looking at the kind of price of properties and things like that and people's inability to access those. But a home is more than just the kind of bricks and mortar it's built off. It's also the environment in which it's located as well. And that has a huge bearing on health and well-being, how attractive places are to live and work. And BNG plays into that as well. So as Helen said, there is the Nature Recovery Fund that's being set up. The intention, in so much as we understand, is that's there to also help address some of the impacts around indirect impacts around protected sites and kind of some of the species mitigation measures as well. And they already can work with biodiversity net gain as well. So if you set them up properly, they can rightly contribute towards the development's biodiversity net gain requirements. And that's something we're trying to highlight as well. So I think what we're hearing is whenever governments, even whenever ministers change, there's always a degree of trying to have to kind of re-explain policies to them. Governments obviously kind of interested in the kind of nature recovery fund aspect, but that doesn't mean it's not interested in biodiversity net gain. It's just, you know, so it's looking to you know, help create that join up between the two, and to continue for biodiversity net gain itself to continue to work through and address challenges. So at the start, there was my little section, there was a poll, and obviously there were people who have found it a challenge. I would guess, I don't know this, but I would guess a number of those possibly are working with or for SME developers. And it has been a challenge for SME developers. It's very new to them. They're dealing with smaller sites, more constrained sites. So there is work going on within the sector and across government to look at how can BNG work better for those things. And there's technologies coming through as well. There's kind of tools available now that allow you to, almost at the touch of a button, kind of identify the offsite habitats that you need and do a trade on those as well. So things are coming forward that are making the process smoother and easier, almost on a kind of weekly basis. And that's great. But I do think we do need to keep supporting those that are less familiar with BNG and perhaps are dealing with sites that have more constrained challenges to make sure it can work for them as well.
Brilliant, thank you. And we've got one question here that's quite long, so bear with me. I work in the creation of habitat banks to secure off-site units through S106 agreements. My experience across various local planning authorities has been highly variable, and one of the primary concerns is that significant costs associated with registering a habitat bank. There is a growing concern that LPAs may view BNG primarily as a revenue-generating opportunity. The requirements for upfront payments rather than allowing costs to be spread over a 30-year period could create a barrier for small landowners and farmers, limiting their ability to participate in the market. In contrast, wealthier generational landowners may have a substantial advantage. Could this be another example of policies disproportionately benefiting the wealthy? Furthermore, how can BNG off-site market be made more accessible for lower income landowners if LPAs remain inflexible on the upfront cost? And that's a very big question, and not something I've come across yet. So who would like to grab that one? Alistair, your hand's up.
Sorry, that was me toggling. So please, yeah, I think Annie stuck a...
I'm happy to come in here. So we're one of the local planning authorities who are offering Section 106s. And I do acknowledge that not all local planning authorities are. We've tried to be quite transparent about the costs of doing so. And if you go to our webpage and look for our Habitat Bank Regulation Service, you can see those costs. As a local planning authority, we only ever want to recover our costs. So this needs to be cost neutral to us. We're not looking to make a profit. And so I suppose when you're talking about upfront charges, ours are in relation to our time to provide advice and to set up the legal agreement. There's also an element, obviously, for paying for the 30 years worth of monitoring, which might be what you're referring to, because that's probably the more significant cost. Certainly from our perspective, we're very happy to negotiate a payment schedule for that. And as part of when we're working with you to develop your habitat bank or your biodiversity gain site, we like to see your business model so we can make sure that you've actually kind of planned your business case for how much you're going to get in via the unit sales versus how much your long-term management monitoring is going to cost. So if it's all kind of well planned through from the initial stage, it should be that those costs will get covered by what you're charging developers for the units. But I do appreciate, as it's a developing market, there might be some differences between different local authorities or responsible bodies. I can see Nick's got his hand up as well.
Over to you, Nick.
No, just building what Annie was just saying. As I mean, I think bear in mind there's no legal planning authorities don't legally have to sign Section 106 agreements with planning authorities. And unlike for a development where they have to engage, they don't with a kind of for a landowner. But many are, as Buckinghamshire are as well. And I think, as Annie said, it's new as well. This is a new area for planning authorities. And so there's a lot of learning going on. References would be made to Planning Advisory Service and sharing, planning authorities sharing information. So I think as BNG develops, you'll get more and more planning authorities sharing their approaches with their peers, and you'll get the kind of evolution of best practice. But there's always an alternative route as well. So there's also responsible bodies that you can engage with. There's more and more of those. And that's your other route for potentially securing a legal agreement as well, if you're not able to have one through the planning authority.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Nick. As we edge towards 12:30. Oh, Alistair, you got your hand up. Sorry, I didn't see that.
If there wasn't any, I was going to ask a question because everyone's talking about BNG, but like, what is success to kind of the projects and how and so a lot of, it'd be great to kind of see the monitoring techniques, how these habitat kind of wins are actually going to be wins for nature. And that's for me quite an exciting bit. So I'd love people's thoughts on the panel to kind of, like, beyond creating these habitats, how are we going to say, that we really nailed it by what we found on site? Because fundamentally, we're using habitats as a proxy for kind of biodiversity success. I say a proxy, but it's the invertebrates on site that are the kind of, and all the rest of the wildlife that is kind of the win. So yeah, I just love the panel's thoughts on that.
I can start off, but I'm sure there's plenty others on here who'd be happy to talk about monitoring for hours and days, because it is so fundamental and crucial, not just to understand that what we've delivered on site is actually doing what it's supposed to, but that BNG as a process is actually delivering what it's supposed to be doing as well. But I also think, and keep coming back to this point, and which you've made as well, Alistair, is this idea that we are, probably still in a place where there's a lot of people who don't understand biodiversity, don't understand nature, and I think one of the wins from the BNG process would be a better, more well-informed society in urban areas around the importance of nature and bringing nature into these more built-up areas. We have just undertaken some research into awareness. One of them was on Biodiversity Net Gain, but the other was on swift nesting bricks and bat bricks, and actually there was overwhelming support from that, and that's just new research that we've just undertaken now, which we'll be putting out publicly soon. So I mean, it was really heartening, but I think part of this process is about informing and hopefully growing the relationship with our communities along with us on this journey.
Thank you, Helen. With that, time has beaten us, and we are going to apologise for not getting through all the questions, but if you want, please reach out to everyone. I'm just going to do some closing remarks here now. I think for me personally, this has been such a great event. And thank you to everyone at CIRIA that's helped put this on. Huge thank you to all the panelists, and to thank you, the audience that have been here as well. I think we peaked at around 219 people being online watching this, which is a huge number of people. Big takeaway from me is we're still learning, still going in the right direction. It's growing. There's huge passion for this to be done right in the first place. And let's keep that energy going. And a big request from us as a group is, can we please ask you to do a bit of feedback? I believe the poll is going to be put into the chat. He says, hoping that Adrian's got just updated, and then we can use that feedback for our next events.
Thank you, Michael. That was brilliant sharing. So thank you so much for walking us through this event. Thanks a lot. All right, I just want to finish with a big thank you to our Committee of Practice members. You can see the logos on the screen here, but there's still an opportunity for anyone who wants to be part of the conversation to join in. So if you're interested, drop us a line. You can find our contact information on the website. Next slide, please. Also, I would like to point it out that we are about to launch the Biodiversity Challenge Awards for 2025. This year is a bit special with with BNG and all the changes in regulations. We wanted to change the focus of this award a little bit. Historically, it's been about doing one thing for biodiversity, and now we want to change that, and we want to go beyond it, and we want to go big for nature. So this is really an opportunity to celebrate the project that you've been working on. We understand, of course, that BNG is very new, but still projects in the making, project that has been completed in the past that have very strong, high biodiversity ambitions. This is what we want to see. We want to hear about the innovation that is out there. We've been hearing through this meeting about new technology, how it's being used, how it's being developed. We definitely want to see that. And of course, many projects have been mentioned throughout this webinar, which we would love to receive those, and maybe they can be recognized as good practice through this award process. The award will be started on March 10, and it's free to submit an entry. You can not only put forward your project, but also you can nominate biodiversity champions, because we want to recognize the people behind the project and how the people can make those successful. All the information can be found on the website, bigchallenge.info. It's going to be updated on the 10th with all the information you need to submit your entries. And I think that's going to be it for me. Next slide, please. Yep, this is it. So just a reminder that the latest guide that was presented by Julia is available on CIRIA website, but also IEMA and CIEEM. Feel free to download it. It's a free one. It's super useful. And I would like to thank our panelists and speakers today. They did an amazing work. And with that, I wish you a great rest of your day.